This is text into action. They're active ways to introduce beats and objectives when interpreting written text and converting it to playable action. These are going to be strategies that I've used in the classroom and that have been recommended by national organizations as well. This is our basic overview of what we're going to do today. What students tend to expect from actors, how to combat that, how you can talk about that in the classroom, what were the great changes that made realistic acting necessary. We're going to talk about the father of realism, essentially what the system is, showing versus doing, some exercises to combat against what is non-realistic acting and what is realistic acting, and we'll look at beats and objectives, battle-oriented objectives, and then some objective activities you can do in the classroom, and then we'll talk about how you can actually do that to the text yourself. So, moving forward. So this is a combination of some information that I've gotten in the classroom when you say, what is it you expect an actor to do? And one of the things that we ask actors to do is to be states of being. So if you get a student out there and you say, okay, well, be happy, go. Don't say anything, just be happy. And invariably, they'll probably try to pull some sort of statue or mug or smile, and it's very forced. It's a caricature of that emotion. So you try something else, be sad, and there will be a caricature of crying. And for the vast majority of time, this was acting. You really did stand in front of a mirror and make faces until you got something that was close to realistic and then put that on stage, and that was fine. But this is no longer what we consider acting. Some of that has to do with film, and it has to do with the major changes that have taken place in society that we're going to talk about in just a moment. So after we establish that just being a state of emotion doesn't work, another thing that we can do to sort of break down the student's perception of what acting is to ask them, what else do you think it is? And some things that come up is like, well, you got to read lines. So I will take a textbook and I'll hand it to them and have them read the lines with emotional states of being. And invariably, the kids are set up effectively for failure in terms of realism because it's never really going to be very realistic. And so other kids will suggest that let's vary the pitch or let's vary the volume and the movement. And the more you heap on, the more ridiculous the performance gets. So you have to ask yourself, what is it that allows people to act in a realistic manner? And one of the major shifts is having to get away from the concept of states of being. So here are some things that took place at the turn of the century, or actually the late 1800s into the 1900s, that dramatically changed the way we look at the world. There were huge shifts in the population. Every time we've had a shift in population or an increase in population in any period of time, the art has shifted. Art always goes to reflect life as we see it, and whenever you have new ideas coming into one area, it changes the way the art looks. But the most incredible change really was probably the Industrial Revolution. So in the revolution, we have now, for the first time in history, steam engines, mechanical looms, railroads, photography, and telegraphs. And what that means is the world is more accessible. It shortened the amount of space between people. Before this time period, if there was a hurricane and you wanted to see it, you either had to travel to that location, by which point it would take you days upon days to actually see the devastation, or you literally waited for an acting troupe to come through and reenact it for you. Now, what you saw in that reenaction would not be anything close to what the actual event was like. The same was true for war. But now you could hop on a train and be there in relatively no time at all. Now you could take pictures. They were taking pictures of bodies on the battlefield, for example, which drastically changed the way in which people felt about war. It wasn't just about the representation of reality through someone else's lens, but people were used to seeing things as they actually were, real pictures, really being able to travel to locations. And that changed the way people thought about the world. So that also led to great changes in thought. Some key aspects of those changes would have been in biology. We have Charles Darwin with The Origin of the Species, starting to combat the way that most folks were thinking about the way in which the life existed on the planet. Economic thoughts were different. 1859, this is the first challenge that anybody's had against capitalism since 1776. Philosophy changed. Friedrich Nietzsche was making comments that were absolutely scandalous for the time period, and all of this thought has to do with the great changes that were going on in society. But for us, and the thing we're going to pay the most attention to, it's going to be Sigmund Freud. He writes Interpretation of Dreams in the 1900s, and he's the first person to bring up and write down anything to do with the subconscious. And that is unique to us because it is the subconscious that allows us to act on stage in a realistic manner. So it's not to say that Konstantin Stanislavski is responsible for being the first person to want to see real life on stage. There had always been a draw to actors that could be realistic in some fashion, but it was usually hit or miss. There were great actors and actresses like Eleanor Duse and Edwin Booth who were consistently realistic on stage in all of the reviews, and people loved them, but they were just credited with being that because of who they were. There was no real detail as to how they were able to do what they were doing. So Stanislavski was a Russian actor from a family with money who wanted to figure out a method of acting on stage that would be consistent. Because he would have performances one night and he would be amazing, the audience would love him. He'd go out, try to recreate exactly what he did, same movements, same facial expressions, same interaction, and he would fall flat. It would be that states of being game that we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation. So he comes up with something called the system. And we're not going to go into too much detail with this, but essentially he sits down with a friend. In the system, there's a whole series of things that he comes up with that will help the actor create real life on stage. We're going to focus on really two. One of the quotes he has under creation of inner mood was he wanted to create a conscious means to the subconscious. Because the subconscious is controlling all of the details of your body on stage and your voice and your breath and all of that. So if you could consciously force your subconscious to interact as though it were real life, you would create real life on stage. The other thing he looks at is the observation of reality. So he's looking at the given circumstances of the play, so this would be the information about the character, and then he's looking at what the goals of the characters are, and those would be objectives, and the through line of the character, so these are super objectives. So if you boil the system down to one basic idea, how to trick your body into believing that you are the character on stage with the same given circumstances, and then to actually do the things on stage. Which brings us to our first real exercise. So typically what I do with students is I have them do that states of being thing where they're trying to act and there's a consistent, it's good, I know what she's trying to do, she seems like she's happy, but it's not real happiness. And then we have them play this game. So Michael Chekhov is an acting theorist that came out shortly after Stanislavski. So if I could get everybody on screen one more time, what I'd like you to do, could you be happy for us? Can we just take a look at what that looks like? Be happy. Yeah, right. So we see this is a caricature of happiness. She is not genuinely happy. Can you be sad? Oh, good. Right. And we're mugging it, okay? But now, Emily, and the reason I had everybody turn on their cameras is because we need something for you to do. So what I'd like you to do, without pushing it, don't do anything else, I want you to look at all of the cameras you have here, and I want you to organize the order of people by what they're wearing, okay? And I want you to do the lightest color to the darkest. Now, as she's doing this, does she look engaged and thoughtful? I mean, yeah, it's a simple task, right? Thank you. We don't actually care what the color is. Now, if I'm in the classroom, I typically say, let's look at the shoes, and we'll count the shoelaces or whatever. And the person will sit there, and sometimes they'll try to mug it again, and we'll say, no, slow down, just count the shoes. And then I'll give them a math problem associated with the shoes. And they'll have so much nuance in trying to figure out what they're doing. And for a lot of new actors, this is the first time they've ever realized that, I just have to do the thing. We've given you a doable task. You're doing the task within the context here. And then your subconscious takes over all that other stuff that you thought you had to worry about. It takes over your body. It takes over your eyelids, your breathing, everything. Now, you can take this a step further if you've got an acting class. You can actually have them get into believing that they're cold and doing the things that you do to keep yourself warm, like rubbing your hands, breathing. And after your body does enough of that, you will get goosebumps on the side of your arm. Now, you can stand there all day long and say, goosebumps, go, and they're never going to come up. But if you do something to trick the subconscious into reacting, then you will always be able to get that true honesty on stage. And the Goosebumps is a great example because it's usually something that the students don't think about, and they're really shocked that they're able to have a subconscious response to something they totally made up. So this is all fine and good until you get to the question, what does this have to do with my lines? What the actor's job is now going to be is to take the text and divide it up into small chunks of doable action. The way you do this is you come up with that character's overall goal. This would be the through line that Stanislavski was talking about in his system. And that's what we call the super objective. So the super objective is the thing the character wants most of all throughout the entire play. Then you have a series of beats. And a beat is a change in thought. Okay, so every time the lines are going and going and going and a thought changes, there's a new beat. And that new beat requires a new and specific objective. It's going to be under the umbrella of the super objective, doable task that you need in that moment. And this is usually phrased to and then an action verb. I want to run. I want to attack. I want to hurt. I want to love. I want to care for. But you would never state I want to be happy, because that's not a doable thing. And then the method that you're going to do that action, and these vary, sometimes they vary in intensity depending on whether or not you're successful, these would be tactics. So tactic is the way in which an objective is pursued. And this is usually phrased by and then some sort of gerund. So I want to comfort by hugging. I want to hurt the person by stabbing. Obstacles are often the things in the scene or in the play that's keeping you from what you want. They're often the things that cause new beats, but not always the things that cause new beats. We're going to play some games to make that a little bit more clear, or at least go over some activities that would make that more clear. But the other thing you need to consider in this, particularly when you're dealing with young actors, is they need to be battle-oriented. Theater is about conflict. Story is about conflict. Without conflict, there is no story. The height of human conflict is, in fact, war, so it's sensible to say that you need battle-oriented objectives. Now, this doesn't mean they need to be violent. It simply means that they need to move similar to they would on a battlefield. For example, in a battlefield, you might have a group of troops. They can either advance, or they can retreat, or they can avoid. So if your tactical objective or tactic and objective is not advancing, retreating, or being evasive, it's not active enough to be on the stage. And then there's a great game you can play called Get the Dollar. You give one person $1. It really helps if you have a real dollar. And their objective is to keep that dollar. And then you give someone else the objective to take that dollar. And then you give them no rules and say, get the dollar. This starts off usually with a little bit of scene play, a little bit of improv, and then with side coaching from the instructor, you really need to get that dollar, get the dollar, and invariably it will lead to running around the room and trying to avoid getting caught by someone to take the dollar. It becomes much more adventurous as people are desperate to get that dollar. And that little game of one person needing a thing and someone else wanting to not give that thing up is a great example to sit down and start talking about tactics without ever actually getting into the text. You can ask, what happened? Well, at first he asked, and then he refused. And then the objective remained the same. He still needed the dollar. He still needed to keep the dollar. And then the tactic changed. So then he threatened. And then he tried to trick him. And then he ran at him. He intimidated him. But you'll notice that tactics will build as they try to do that thing. But as long as they're honestly pursuing getting the dollar, it's going to be realistic acting on stage. So that's a fun exercise to do. Like I said, it is more effective in person, but it can be done on a digital platform. What we're going to talk about now is how to make sure the students understand really the nature of super objectives, objectives, and obstacles. So let's say that your character, your character is in a race, right? Any foot race. The super objective is to, of course, win the race. If a log falls across the middle of the path, this is an obstacle. So this would be a change in thought, right? If the gun has gone off and you're running the race and a log falls in front of you, there's a change in thought. So we now have a new a new objective, a new specific objective. And that new specific objective is simply to get past the log. Now, the tactical choice you use as a character says a lot about who you are and what the story is. You can do anything to get through that log. You could jump, you could get over by jumping, you could get under by digging, you could get around it by running, you could get through it by sawing, you could eat through the log, you could dissolve it, you could set it on fire. All of those choices tell you a little bit more about who the character is in that. So that race metaphor keeping in mind, let's talk a little bit about examples in literature that already exist. What we're going to do here is we're just going to talk about this. Let's take The Wizard of Oz and let's take The Wicked Witch of the West. Could someone tell me what The Wicked Witch of the West's super objective is?
The ruby red slippers.
That is a great answer, and it's one of the first things that most students will say as well. The reason I would say it might be a little bit larger is she still will want something after she has those slippers. So for the super objective, why does she want the slippers? Power, yes. I mean, and the super objective frequently is something that's so overarching that it may even extend beyond the confines of the story. She wants power over Oz. That's a great super objective. So a series of things happen, and one of the things she needs to have that power is to get the slippers, which would be our next immediate objective. But there's an obstacle, and what is that obstacle? Dorothy is the obstacle. So her objective is to get the slippers from Dorothy. What are the tactical things that she does throughout the course of the story?
She sends the she makes them fall asleep in the field.
She does do that. Anything else that she does?
She tries to grab them in the beginning and can't.
Right.
She makes the apple trees throw apples.
Yes. And I really like what Casey is doing here too. And I think it's important at the beginning to like lit all of the things that the person does, all of those tactics, just take them all in. But what Casey is starting to work towards is that there is a progression. I mean, particularly in realism, right? She doesn't just walk up to Dorothy and threaten her life immediately for the shoes. I mean, she does that in the end. But there is a logical progression of tactical choices. The first thing she does is simply try to take them, and she can't. So then she ramps it up, right? She threatens. She has the apples thrown at them as they walk a little farther. They get a little bit farther in, and she threatens the scarecrow with fire. She eventually winds up sending flying monkeys, and then ultimately she's going to kill her in the castle whenever that really scary red hourglass goes off. But there's a progression, and that progression is necessary. And particularly in an acting class, you want to talk about that subtlety moving up so you don't just jump to the most extreme. Unless your character is nuts, and then absolutely jump to that most extreme to start with. So you can do this a couple of times with students, and once you're sure that they understand what that progression is, and they've got a good sense of that running metaphor, you can start talking about statues. This activity comes from one of our lesson plans, and we'll talk about how to get to those later. What this is a basic exercise where you have a group of students, and you count them off so that they have partners. You have a circle in the middle and a circle on the outside. So everybody has a partner. And then you give them 90 seconds to shape that partner in some appropriate way into a statue doing a thing. And then what I typically do is go around and we'll look at these statues as though they're in a museum. So they'll have people dancing, they'll have students cheering, running, they'll just doing an activity. And then because turnabout is fair play, switch them so that their partner gets revenge and gets to have them do a task. And then on the third round, what we do is we give them a task that would be associated with a tactic or an objective. So now we want them to do something. They need to be in the middle of doing something to another character. And then they shape them into these statues. And once they've done that, we go to play another game. But before I get too far into that, I want to mention if you are doing this on a digital platform, one of the best ways to do it is to demonstrate it with a student on the digital platform and then to send them out into breakout sessions, just their two partners. One partner will coach the other person into a dynamic and interesting statue. screenshot what that is, and then they'll switch, do it again for the other one, screenshot what that is, and then you can bring all of the images back together, which actually allows everybody to look at the whole museum at once, streamlines the class discussion on which activities are more engaging, which activities draw the eye a little bit more. Psychological gesture. This is ultimately what we're getting to here, which was a acting training that you might bring to get yourself to feel the text. And we talk about that a little bit more in the Shakespeare webinar, but that's essentially where this is coming from. So introducing objective physically. The next game that we play is just to have everybody take a little walk around the room, and what I like to do is just have them freeze in poses. And in freezing in these poses, we talk about what a dynamic and interesting pose might be. So I have that. I'm going to clap, whistle, make some sort of sound as they're walking, and when they hear that clap, they're going to freeze in a pose. It needs to be interesting or engaging, and then I have them switch. If they did a pose up high in the first round, I'll ask them to go low in the last round. If they went low last time, go high in the next round. So we're talking about stage dynamics and just getting them to freeze in these statues. And once they've done that a couple of times, then we layer in objective phrases. So a very easy one, and particularly because we were talking about theater being about conflict, is to hurt. It's a very simple thing. It always exists in theater. There's always a character that wants to hurt another character for one reason or another, because conflict is interesting. So I make sure that they are understanding that it's to hurt, but not another person in the room. It's an imaginary person. You need to be freezing in a position where you are hurting an imaginary character. So they walk around the room, clap my hands, and they freeze in that position. And then we go around and we, just like we did with the exercise earlier in the statues, we talk about which are the most interesting ones. And almost without fail, half the class is punching, kicking, or stabbing. Which, yes, technically is answering the question, but it's not interesting because everybody had the same thought. So one of the key things that this conversation does is point out that, yes, you could be technically correct, but you may not be interesting. The tactical choice is often the only freedom the actor has to make their interpretation of the text different. So once I point that out and we do the same exercise again, then people are hurting in very interesting ways. So you'll see students freeze over their phone where they're cyberbullying someone, or you'll have a student pretending to whisper at someone else. And that psychological understanding of a character and how that too is also physical, even though it's not literal physical violence, it's still a physical activity, is a huge leap for a lot of students, particularly if they're just learning about textual interpretation. Now, we don't leave it on hurt. We go to much more pleasant things like characters flirting, being kind, comforting, so that they understand that these are physical activities. And then what you can do is start layering in language. So you hit your pose, whatever your objective is, and they're in that physical thing, and you give them the line you or please or something simple, and you will hear the variations in choice from all of the students that are informed by their physical position. And that is revolutionary because they're understanding that it's the body, their physical choice that they made up on their own, that's really changing the interpretation of the text. So this activity can also be seen in our resources, which we will get to at the very end of this as to where to find those. Everything we've just talked about, we would do, and this is something that I do as a separate day in class entirely, with Henry V. And the reason I do it with Henry V is because if you can do it with Shakespeare, you can do it with anything. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility, but when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the actions of a tiger, stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favored rage, now set the teeth and stretch the nostril wide, hold hard the breath, bend up every spirit to his full height, on, you noblest English, whose blood is fet from fathers of war proof. Without any context whatsoever, and of course you would want to change this for your age group. If this is high school, this might work. You might not want to open with this text and say middle school. What is the super objective of the speaker here, do you think? Fight. Okay, so because we're at war, right? You would gather from this text. And again, I choose this because war, battle-oriented objectives. So yeah, super objective is literally to win the war, so it doesn't get more battle-oriented than that. So once we've established the super objective, what I like to do is go around and say, okay, let's find out what the beats are. So if one of you could just say stop when you hear me get to a change in thought. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. But when the blast of war? Okay, I could see that. You could argue too that it changes after or close the wall up with our English dead as well, right? Now,
To me, it would be the third line.
in peace? Okay. We're going to go ahead and say, we're just going to do this 3 beats, okay? We're going to do once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. That's 1 beat. In peace, there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. We're going to say that's 2 beats. And then, but when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of a tiger. We're going to say that's 3 beats. Okay, we're not going to worry about the rest of the text. So who thinks they understand what the objective of that first beat is? Oh, and you're 100% right. There should be dynamic shifts from beat to beat. And the reason it has to be is because if that first beat and first tactic worked, then there'd be no more play. It doesn't work, so he's got to shift. So if she's doing that to make them feel strong by telling them the thing, how you might go to threaten. So would you mind threatening us? All right, so what we're going to do real quick, and we're just going to model this with, Emily's going to try to encourage us. Margarita, if you could try to make us feel strong with that statement about peace, but this is not your time. And then if, Casey, you could read the last one in a threatening manner. We're just going to watch them in sequence. Go ahead, Emily, when you're ready.
Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, or close up the wall with our English dead.
In peace, there is nothing, so becomes a man, as modest stillness and humility.
But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of a tiger.
Good, good, good. Okay, great. So what happens over time is you line up a series of students in their statues, and they read their objectives focusing only on that line, and you get a series of monologues, and it causes the whole thing to have a musicality that absolutely would not exist if you weren't thinking about the action and the goal of the character. It's one of my favorite exercises to start getting into the body with them, and then once you do it with Shakespeare, you can hand them something else. But giving them a text that does not have clear delineation as to like what's going on is a good way to get them to make their own choices. Because really, dividing a text up into beats and choosing objectives, there's no right answer. There are better and more effective answers, but there's no right answer. It's what the actor does to interpret the words. They're just basing it on what they think the actions of the text are. So this one's a lot of fun to do with the groups. I usually give like 4 people to a group. This could be done in breakout rooms in a digital setting, and then bring them back with one person reading those objective choices. Because ultimately, you don't have multiple actors. You have one actor doing all of those transitions into the different thoughts. And that is sort of the introduction to how to get them to look at beats and objectives that are textually based, that are raised stakes and interesting all the way through from the beginning. And the reason I like to do it this way is because it forces them to think about what the body shape is before they ever start thinking about the intellectual aspect of what does it mean, what is the author trying to get at, and all of the things that you typically do in a literature class. There's nothing wrong with that in the literature class, it just isn't as effective on stage when you're trying to get people to be seen and heard. So, one of the things that's a good tool here is this link. There are several online. You can find them. This link happens to go to a page of objectives and tactic words. So it's words that end in ing and they're action verbs. So you can find nuance in your action verb choice when you're trying to assign what this beat is trying to do. I want to make sure that everybody is aware of where we can find these, and I am wrapping this up here. The GaDOE instructional resources are available on our website. You can find those exercises that we just discussed in the Fundamentals of Theater course and then also in the Acting 1 course. These are all of the classes that we currently have in our instructional resources. For each class, there will be a curriculum map. All of these resources are supplemental. They are not prescriptive. They are simply meant to enhance what you're doing in the classroom. If you like it, then that's the way to go. You play to your strengths. The only thing that PSC is concerned about is whether or not you're teaching the standards. So this is an organization you could follow if you chose. If you're a new teacher, you could download these lesson plans and have an entire year's worth for any of these courses. Each curriculum map has unit plans for each of the units. The lesson plans have differentiated learning strategies for adapted assignments and increased rigor, and then a detailed step-by-step how to do that lesson should you want to look at it. And then, as I mentioned, the assessments are there. They're not all rubrics, but many of them are, which means they're tied directly to your standards, and it's a great way to show administrators why this theater game actually is a functioning assessment of what's going on. Beyond that, we have a series of resources that include PowerPoints for basically anything that you're covering, from playwriting to scenic design to multiple historical context and cultural aspects of theater. And then fundamentals of theater is one of the areas you would find this particular lesson plan talking about Stanislavski and text into action. You can find these on this is the Acting 1, Unit 1 is another place that you would find where these games that we've talked about today would fit. If you go to the GaDOE Fine Arts webpage, you can skip the TRL entirely, click on the link that says Instructional Resources for Theater, and then it will pull down a document, a Word document with all of these hyperlinks that will actually download them immediately to your computer without you having to search for it. So what I would ask you to do if you are a teacher in the classroom, please choose 2 of these games. Try one aspect of these games and try it out, write it down, document your experience, and then when we meet again, I would love to hear your feedback. Or even if we don't meet again, I would love to hear your feedback. If you need anything in terms of instructional supports, or you think there's something that we could be doing for you at the state level, please let us know. If you don't already, please follow us on social media. That's at Jess Booth or the hashtag ArtsEdGA. That's going to be the fastest way to get information as to what we're doing right now in the fine arts at DOE, and also our Facebook page, GaDOE Fine Arts.
Additional
Department.
questions, please contact the Fine Arts team. Jessica Booth, Paul McLean, Casey Hall.